Hey guys, Patrina here. Welcome back to Homegrown Florida. Today I am showing you what I am doing with all the tomatoes from my spring harvest. I have bags and bags and bags of tomatoes in my freezer and I need to get them out of there because there are so many. I think when I measured it all out, I think I had like 30 pounds of tomatoes. And I've been keeping them in my freezer because I've been collecting them from the plants over the last couple months, and I was not ready to process them, and I've always found that it's just so much easier to just throw it in the freezer until I'm ready to start processing them. So today we are going to be working on 4 recipes. We're going to do salsa, we're going to do spaghetti sauce with meat, we're going to do diced tomatoes, and then our last recipe, which is going to be our own tomato powder to use as tomato paste. Look at all those tomatoes. First recipe we're starting with is salsa ranchero, and this is a recipe that I got from the Ball Book of Canning, and I'll put it down in the description because I think it's a really interesting canning book. It's not the original Ball canning book because that one is a bit more traditional. It has all the common recipes that you could find on the National Center for Home Food Preservation site, but these are unique recipes that Ball has tested themselves, and they have much more interesting ingredients. So in this particular recipe, it has 3 pounds of plum tomatoes, 3/4 a pound of jalapeno peppers, 4 cloves of garlic, 1 medium onion, 2 teaspoons of salt, half a cup of cilantro, and 1/3 of a cup of actual fresh lime juice. And I say that because that is almost unheard of in the canning world, to use fresh lemon or lime juice. And that is because like fresh lemons and limes, especially ones that maybe you grow in your garden, don't always have the same acidity that bottled lemon and lime juice. So a lot of the times what you see in recipes is to use, actual bottled vinegar and bottled lemon juice because they have a very specific acidity standard that they need to meet in order to be sold. But in this particular recipe, they used fresh limes. Now, I did some variation to this recipe. I did not use plum tomatoes. I used my red currant tomatoes, which were little tiny ones, but I did 3 pounds. I'm not very much into spice, so instead of 3/4 a pound of the jalapeno peppers here, I'm putting in about 1/2 a pound of cubanellas, and then 1/4 a pound of some hot peppers I had from last year. I think they might have been ancho chili peppers or something like that. I did put the garlic and the onions in, just like it said, and I did do the salt. I did not put in the fresh cilantro because in our house, cilantro tastes like soap. We're those weird people, so we don't put cilantro in it. You could put something like parsley or oregano if you would rather do that. I just skipped it and didn't put either. And then the last item, I don't actually have fresh limes, so I used the bottled lime juice. Now, I absolutely love this recipe because of the addition of lime juice. A lot of the times you can substitute lemon or lime when something calls for vinegar, because I think lemon and lime and vinegar all have a very similar acidity. But lime juice in salsa is outstanding. Vinegar always kind of comes through in the taste, and I'm not a fan of it. And lemon juice is pretty good. It's a good, alternative. But lime juice, it just really hits. And when you mix it with a Mexican dish, it is outstanding. So I love this recipe from the moment I saw it. I have made it before, but I made it according to what the book had said. The book was basically that this would be a chunky style of salsa. And I wanted to make this round of salsa a restaurant style. So that means it is ground up or blended up. I want this to be a real thin style of salsa. That's the kind that I like. I've been wanting to do this for a while. The chunky style is really good still. We still eat it. It's awesome, but I much prefer the restaurant style. One thing that you probably noticed here that is a big no-no in the canning world is I did not peel these tomatoes. There was multiple reasons for this. One, they are tiny tomatoes. These are currant style tomatoes, it would be next to impossible to get these skins off. However, I did purchase recently a food mill, and I'm going to show you that later on in the video. But at the day that I was making this salsa, I didn't have the food mill in yet, so I couldn't use it. And I really wanted to use these red currant tomatoes, so I did not remove the skins off these red currant tomatoes, and I strongly encourage you to definitely try to do that. Use a food mill or whatever else, because there is an understanding that the skins of tomatoes and the skins of potatoes can harbor botulism for longer or in more higher quantities than, say, the inside of the tomato, and that's why you want to not include that. I have seen recipes out there that have been tested where cherry tomatoes were used in salsas, and the skins were not removed from those. So, you know, it's your house, it's your kitchen, you'll have to make that decision. But the food mill is a really good idea, especially if you plan on doing it like a restaurant style salsa, which is very thin rather than chunky style, because if you're going for a chunkier style, you can't use a food mill because it does make everything very, very thin. And there's no issue whatsoever with trading out your peppers. So hot peppers versus sweet peppers, it doesn't make a difference in canning. So you can trade out, you know, like I did, where I didn't use any jalapenos. I used a couple ancho chili peppers, but I didn't use anything spicier than that. And then, you know, more than, you know, 3/4 of it, I used a bell pepper style of peppers. And in these recipes, peppers are peppers. So if you wanted it super spicy, you put super spicy. You can put a habanero in there if you wanted to, but you don't want to go over the quantity. You don't want to go over the 3/4 pound, because that's what's been tested for the right acidity. And that's so important, especially in recipes like this one where it's going to be water bath canned. So you want to stick to those ratios properly. Even if you're going to trade out the peppers, make sure that the overall pepper count is still the same. So here we are, I am adding that salt. It's 2 teaspoons of salt like I mentioned earlier. And then here is our 1/3 cup of lime juice. I'm going to get all that on the stove and I'm going to simmer it for, I think I simmered it for about an hour. And what you're really trying to do is make sure that all of those vegetables get nice and soft, and that a lot of the liquid from the tomatoes, because tomatoes have a lot of liquid, even these little guys, that some of that has boiled off so that you get a more thicker texture on the salsa. Once I've maybe reduced it by about 1/3 of the liquid in the pot, I'm going to bring it over to my blender here and I'm going to blend it up. And this is what's making it that restaurant style salsa. Since my salsa is coming out of the pot and it's very, very hot, do not fill your blender up all the way. Make sure that maybe you're only doing about 1/3 to 1/2 full, never more than that. Something about hot liquid really expands and inside the blender, and you could pop the top off and then it splatters all over your kitchen, and that is not fun, or it could damage your machine. And all I'm going to do here now is I'm just going to pulse it about 2 or 3 times, because I'm getting to that texture without necessarily blending it to shreds. I want it to still have not chunkiness, but like a graininess to it. That's how I like my salsa. So I did my first half of the recipe here, and then I'm going to do the second half. I went ahead and put that back into the pot, and I'm putting it back on the stove because we do want to pack this hot. Whenever you're doing a water bath can, you always want to pack your jars hot. So I have just washed all of these jars out, and now I'm going to put them inside of my Presto electric canner. And I'm filling the canner up with water with the jars inside of it. That's what Presto recommends. And then that whole thing gets put into the electric pressure canner. If you guys have not seen one of these yet or used one of these yet, they are so easy. They have like a little 2-page guide. Oh, right here, I just wanted to say I'm splashing in a little bit of white vinegar because that just helps keep the jars nice and clean. And not get that hard water film on them that sometimes they used to. But the Presto canner is so easy to use. It comes with like a 1-pager. One side is how to water bath, the other side is how to pressure can, and it's just a list of like 5 or 6 steps, and it is So easy, so easy. I hit the button, I follow the instructions, I put the amount of time that I need, and then when it's done, it kind of beeps at you and tells you what to do next. So it just beeped at me, letting me know that the jars have been warmed. That's another cool feature of this product is it tells you to put the jars in first so that it can heat those jars up for your hot pack. So I'm removing them out with water in them, and then I'm dumping that water into the sink. If you dump it back, you're going to overfill your pot. After I've dumped all of the water out of the jars, now it's time to fill. Now this recipe did say, I think it was supposed to be 5 pints, and that is not what happened. It ended up being only 3 pints worth. I'm not sure what happened there, but this happens to me all the time. I follow the recipe perfectly. I weigh my ingredients to make sure that it is the exact amount of pounds that it calls for, and I still end up with either 2 mini jars or 2 less. So you'll notice here that even though it only called for 5 jars, I think I made 8 jars ready. Now, I knew I was going to be doing other recipes, so it didn't bother me to have cleaned and prepared extra jars. But I would strongly encourage you to always add 1 or 2 more jars just to be ready. And if you don't use them, it's fine. Just, wash them out, or you just washed them, so that's not a big deal. Put them back on your shelf and use them the next time. But if you get through this entire process to here and you don't have jars that are warmed up, you have to stop, wait, get those jars warmed up. It's just, it kind of messes up your progress as you're moving along. So now we've got all our jars filled, and I'm just taking a paper towel with some white vinegar on it to wipe my jar rims off, because tomato sauce is very oily, which is kind of surprising. It's oily and sticky. And if you get any bit of it that's still on the edge of that jar, the seals will not take, and then you've done all of this for nothing. The other thing I do is I take my lids and I put them, just out of view of the camera right here is a bowl with hot water in it, not boiling, just super hot water. And I have let the lid sit in that hot water for a couple minutes while I was heating up the jars. And I'm going to screw the bands on fingertip tight, and we're going to put them right back into the canner. Then, as easy as it was to heat them up, you just put them back in and you tell the canner, okay, go ahead and get started. And now it just does everything on its own. It goes through the 20 minutes that it's going to take to water bath can it, and then it'll take a 5-minute cool down period, and then it's ready to open and allow you to open at that point. Be careful when lifting out your jars. They are very, very hot, and you also want to leave them alone. So put them on the counter and leave them there for at least 12. I always wait 24 hours. I do it, that day, and then the next day I come through and I check them. And you're just going to want to check the seals to make sure the seals, sealed properly, that the button isn't popping down in the center, and that you can lift it by just the lid itself. And I usually take those rings off and I will store them. The next recipe we're going to be doing today is canned diced tomatoes, or canned stewed tomatoes. I have never made these before. It looked pretty straightforward compared to all the other canning recipes I've done with tomatoes in the past. I still have not got my food mill at this point, but I wouldn't want to use the food mill in this recipe anyway, because you want these tomatoes to be like diced tomatoes or stewed tomatoes. And so what I did was, all of my tomatoes, since they don't all come in at the same time, I just put them in these little bags, these reusable bags, and I freeze them. And then when they come out of the freezer, it's like magic. I just take a knife and I just kind of pierce the skin, and they just peel right off. The skin peels right off. No boiling, no blanching, no putting in cold water, nothing. Just stick them in the freezer once you pull them out of the garden, and when you get ready to use them, you pull them and let them defrost in the sink or on the counter for, I don't know, overnight is usually what mine take. And then they just pop right off. It does make them have an excessive amount of liquid that I don't feel happens when you do it by blanching them. So you do have to cook off the liquid a little bit longer than what you would have to do if you didn't. I don't know why that is. I'm not sure. But it does make pulling the skins off. Incredibly easy. According to Ball, there are 3 ways that you can do diced or stewed tomatoes. And the way that I'm doing it is the first way that they mentioned, which is you dice up the tomatoes and you're not adding any juice. So you're dicing them up. You're going to take the skins off and you're going to core them. So when I'm cutting them here, I'm kind of cutting around the core. And then you just drop those pieces into the jar and you just keep dropping. And eventually what will happen is the juices from the tomatoes will fill up the space in the jar that's empty. And you kind of keep pushing them down, squishing them down, and they will create their own juice. This seemed like the easiest way for me, so that I didn't have to collect the juices of the tomatoes, and you know, it just seemed like it would be more simple. And it was. I will say the downside of doing it this way rather than the 2 other ways I'm going to tell you about is that it takes longer water bath canning it. And if you were water bath canning on your stove, I can see why this might be annoying, because this way it takes 85 minutes of water bath canning processing versus the 45 minutes that the 2 other ways do. And so the 2 other ways are the same thing, where you dice up your tomatoes and you put them in the jar. But instead of squishing them down so that the tomatoes create their own juice, you actually will add tomato juice to it in both of those recipes. But the way the recipes are different is, one, the tomatoes are cold in one, and that's called a raw pack. And then the other way is you actually put these tomatoes, instead of straight in the jar, you put them into a pot, heat them up, and then you add liquid to them, whether it's tomato juice or water, and then you scoop that out and you pour that into hot jars. That's called a hot pack. Now those only take 45 minutes to process, so that is a lot less time. It's almost half the time to process. But being as it's in my Presto electric canner rather than just on my stovetop that I have to manage and watch, you know, I don't care if it's 45 minutes or 85 minutes, because I'm going to be outside in the garden. I'm going to be walking the dogs. I mean, I could go up to the grocery store if I wanted to. And I think that day I actually did go to the grocery store while it was finishing, because you don't really have to monitor it at all. It's one of the things that I absolutely love about this canner. Now, if it was on the stove, I could definitely see why you would want to do the 45 minutes of the raw pack or the hot pack versus this, what I'm calling the squish method. And I almost forgot, as I was doing this recipe, I got through the second jar and realized that I forgot to add lemon juice. Lemon juice is so important when canning tomatoes. Just like we do with our salsa, we added lime juice. If you're canning tomatoes and you're doing it in a water bath canner, you have to add an acid. I know there's going to be people out there that say, no, you don't have to add an acid. Tomatoes are acidic enough, but tomatoes are borderline. And because I'm not using a standard paste tomato, I'm using all different kinds of tomatoes because I use what I have. I don't know the acidity levels of these tomatoes, and so I just want to be careful. It's 1 tablespoon. I never even taste it when it comes to these types of recipes or spaghetti recipes. I bear on the side of caution and I just say, okay, we're going to add our lemon juice. Thankfully, I remembered it, because that would have been a bad situation for me to have gone through all this effort and forgot to add the lemon juice, and then I wouldn't have been comfortable using these in recipes or using them at all, depending on how quickly I realized that I didn't do that. Thankfully, we got it. We added the lemon juice. You can also add salt at this point. I don't, and that's because of how I plan on using these. I don't just eat stewed tomatoes or diced tomatoes or put them in something that's cold. I am almost always going to be cooking them in something. So I use them in pasta dishes, in chilies, in Mexican dishes, all kinds of stuff. And so whenever I'm going to use them, I'm going to pull them out of the jar. I'm going to drain the liquid from the tomatoes. I'll put the tomatoes into whatever dish I'm using it for. And then I season the whole dish at that point. And that just reduces our salt intake, which I think is important. And so for us, we season and salt to taste rather than just, so that when we open the can, it has better flavor once it's opened. I will add that flavor and that seasoning into the end dish rather than in the canning process. And I do that in a lot of my canning recipes. Now the salsa, we added salt to that one, and that's mainly because we will eat our salsa without being cooked, right? We're gonna open that jar and we're gonna dip chips in it right away. I don't wanna have to salt every single one of my, bowls of salsa every time I'm going to have them. So I add my salt then. My spaghetti sauce is another example. Sometimes I add salt, but most of the time I don't. And that's because I will season it later when I'm cooking with it. You might be wondering why this was the first time I did diced tomatoes, because I do can quite a bit of things and I can a lot of interesting things, but not something as plain and simple as diced tomatoes. And that was just because diced tomatoes are so cheap in the grocery store that it just didn't make sense to me to use a canning jar for that rather than for other things that I would like to do. But this season I had such a large harvest of tomatoes. And the season before that, in fall, I also had a really large batch of tomatoes. And the spring before that I did. So I have had jars and jars of different tomato products on my shelf, and I have still not used them all. I still had 3 jars of salsa and I had 3 jars of spaghetti sauce. And I had, I think, 4 or 5 jars of tomato paste. And so I had so many tomato products still that we have not used that I thought, I got to pick something else. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to create this backlog of tomato products. And I thought, well, I use diced tomatoes. And it's one of the things that I still buy from the grocery store that's a tomato product. So why don't I make just a few jars? I made 4. And let me see if I end up using those and if I can replace buying them from the grocery store with this overabundance of tomatoes. If I didn't have as large of a harvest as I did this year, I probably wouldn't have made this or canned this just because the cost doesn't always make sense. But this is just one more thing I don't have to buy from the grocery store, so that feels great. So we're getting prepared for water bath canning, and I'm just wiping those lids off. It may not be oily this time, but it's still any amount of that little bit of juice or tomato bits gets on the edge of the jar, it will keep them from canning. I did soak my lids just to get them warmed up and get that kind of rubber sealant thing warmed up. And then we're just going to put them in there. And I'm putting in my Presto canner, I'm putting them in cold because that is what this is. This is a raw pack in its own juices, and so it's cold. So the water in the canner is cold, the jars are cold, and they're all going to heat up together. And in 85 minutes, we are done. And so I pull them out. You can see that I probably could have squished them in there a little bit more because there is some liquid in the bottom. That is okay. There is nothing wrong with that. That happens with lots of different recipes. I swear it happens every time with my jams. But it's just extra liquid. That tells me that I could have put more in there. I'm always worried about overfilling the jars and they, not being able to seal properly. So that's just my own phobia there. We're gonna get this kitchen cleaned up a little bit in preparation for our next recipe. And just in time, I did get the food mill. So I'm gonna be showing you that in just a moment. We're going to be making my spaghetti with meat sauce. This is an approved recipe through Ball and the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So in preparation for this recipe, I wanted to order a food mill, and there were so many different kinds of tomato mills or food mills. Some of them could attach to my KitchenAid mixer. Some of them are freestanding ones that have a turn or rotator that you crank. And then there's this one, which is the table or the bowl top food mill, manual food mill. I went with this one mainly because of the reviews. The reviews on the electric one that hooks into the KitchenAid really caused me a lot of concern because some people talked about it burning out their KitchenAid mixer, and I really love my KitchenAid mixer. That is not a cheap product to buy, and I did not want to ruin the motor on it, so I opted out for that. There was other people on there that said that type also would put metal shavings in your food, which was, I didn't want to waste these tomatoes that I spent an entire season growing and loving and caring for. So I wasn't really cool with that. There was the tabletop one that I was strongly considering, but there were some reviews where people talked about some of the plastic breaking off and falling into the food, and I wasn't really keen on that. So I went back to old school, right? The old school is the manual hand over the pot crank food mill, which is what this is. I've never used one before. I've actually never seen one in person before. I went and I looked on Amazon for the one that had the best reviews that most people liked, and this was the one that came from that. They come with 3 different discs. There's a fine, a medium, and like a coarse disc, and they recommended using the coarse disc. And I agree that with most tomatoes, I think that the coarse disc would work well, but I was using a mixture of tomatoes in this recipe. I had some slicing tomatoes, I had some cherry tomatoes, I had some grape tomatoes, and I also had my red currant tomatoes. Now I think the medium would have been a better grain to use on those currant tomatoes because a lot of the seeds did come through on that one, on the coarse grate. But that's okay. I don't mind some seeds in it. It did do its job and it pulled out a lot of the skins and, you know, the cores and the pieces that you don't want in your spaghetti sauce. It took me a solid 30 minutes to figure out how to use this thing. It was actually very easy to put together. The instructions were very simple, but what the instructions didn't include was how to use a food mill. It showed you how to clean it, it showed you how to put it together, but it did not tell you the appropriate way to use this thing. So I struggled. I thought that you put the tomatoes in raw into the food mill and that it would break them down and then you cook what comes out the bottom. That is not the case. It took me a few YouTube videos and a lot of frustration turning and cranking this thing to realize that it was not going to break down fresh tomatoes. It was just squeezing the juice out of the tomatoes, but it wasn't getting the pulp out of the tomatoes. And so I watched a couple YouTube videos. I realized that the thing that I was not understanding was that these tomatoes need to be cooked before you put them in the food mill. And I don't know if that, nobody mentioned that in any of their videos. They just went on to cook to put it in there. And I thought, maybe I'm just special and did not realize this. But apparently when using a food mill, it is best to cook them first before you put them through. And this took me a while, as you can see here. It took me a while to figure that out. So once I figured that out, that the food mill required the tomatoes to be cooked, I stuck them on the stove and I let them cook for maybe 20 minutes. It was just until they were soft. So once they were soft, I put them into the food mill and I started to turn them. And when you're turning your food mill, you have to turn it clockwise and then do a complete turn counterclockwise and then clockwise and then do the complete turn counterclockwise. And that's basically just loosening up any of the skins and stuff that's getting stuck to the grate on the bottom and keeping the food from going through. And it did take a little bit more time than I expected. I don't know what I thought. I guess I thought that you'd turn this thing like 3 times and all your tomatoes would come through. That's not the case. It does take a little bit more time, probably about 10 minutes for me to process all of these. But I was really happy with the end result. No metal shavings in my food, no burning up my KitchenAid, no skins. Most of the seeds, you know, didn't come through. I think the little tomato seeds probably did. But pretty much it worked especially almost perfectly. And I was really, really pleased with the leftover, right? So all the skins and stuff that were in the top of the food mill that didn't make it down to the bottom, because you don't want that in your sauce, I have a use for that. You could compost it, but we have another recipe, our 4th recipe in this video, that I show you what to do with that and do something that is actually good for your kitchen. Not that compost isn't good for your kitchen, it's good for your garden, but being able to use every part of the tomato and all parts of that plant, that nothing went to waste, was really just, I was geeking out about that big time. So once I got all of it processed, and it took a couple rounds, and as you can see here, I was filling this thing up. Once I figured it out, once I got going, I really just started filling this thing out and just kept rotating it kind of slowly and then a little faster, and it just processed those tomatoes great, and I love this thing now. So then once it's through everything, or I've gotten as much out as I can, you can see we have quite a bit of liquid. What you probably can't tell from this is that there's a lot of pulp in it too. And the liquid kind of rises to the top, and the pulp kind of goes to the bottom. Now I'm going to cook this down. I'm going to cook it down by about 1/3. I want this to be a really, really thick sauce. And so that's what I've done now. And so I'm going to pour that into another bowl, and that will give me a chance to make my ground beef or brown my ground beef in this same pot. I'm very much into creating as little dishes as possible. So I got it back on the stove. I added my ground beef. It was 1 pound. I did a very different recipe than the recipe that National Center for Home Food Preservation recommends, because they recommend using onions and garlic cloves and mushrooms and fresh herbs and all those things, and they tested that to make sure that all that was appropriate with the ratios. I used the same ratios for the meat based on how many tomatoes I had left. And so it was they said 30 pounds to 2.5, and I ended up with like 10 pounds, so like almost 1 pound of meat. But what I didn't do is I didn't add all those other vegetables, which is fine because all of those other vegetables that they mentioned are low acid foods. And so that would just bring down the acidity level in it. And I don't need to do that because I decided to go with powdered or dehydrated herbs, which don't generally do that. Instead of garlic cloves, I did garlic powder. Instead of onions, I did onion powder. Instead of the fresh parsley and oregano and stuff, I used my dried Italian seasoning blend that I make myself and grow in the garden. Once the meat is browned, I did pour off the extra grease from it because you don't really want that in your jar. It could, kind of clog it up and make it to where it doesn't seal properly, or it could create like a thick layer of, grease in the top of your jar, and that's not recommended. And then here I am adding all of my seasonings. I'm doing the salt, the pepper. Here's the garlic powder, lots and lots of garlic powder. And then our onion powder, our Italian seasoning blend. And then I did add, this is really unlike me, but I felt like it would be a little bit flat if I didn't add some kind of spice. So these were dehydrated ancho chili peppers, so I just added like a bit of flakes into it just to give it just the tiniest bit of heat, but not much. And then lots and lots of the Italian seasoning mix. After that, I'm adding in some sugar. Now, I don't like my spaghetti sauce to taste sweet, and the Ball or the National Center for Home Food Preservation calls for like 1/2 cup of brown sugar, and that just seemed like a lot. But the tomatoes make this extremely acidic, and I didn't want that much acid. I wanted to counteract that with some of the sugar, and that really does that. So I added just about 2 tablespoons of sugar to my sauce. Make sure you taste it and make sure you like it, because that's what it's going to taste like when it comes out of the jar. Now I'm getting my canner here ready, and I'm doing a pressure can versus a water bath can on this. And it calls for, I believe, 90 minutes of pressure canning. I let the jars heat up in the pressure canner, and when it was all ready to go, I pulled them out, and here we are filling them up. Usually this fills 3 quart-sized jars for me, but for some reason this time it only filled 2. Once again, I have no idea why this happens to me, but it does. I'm guessing it has something to do with the liquid content of the tomatoes that I used and how much it cooked down versus if I were to have used a paste tomato that has much more pulp in it and less liquid. So once I got those all filled up, then I'm just going to do the same thing as we did with the salsa. I'm going to take a paper towel with a little bit of vinegar on it, and I'm going to wipe that down. Wipe it down really, really good. You do not want to spend 90 minutes pressure canning this and it not seal. And this is one of the major reasons why things don't seal when you pressure can them, is you did not clean those jar lids or those jar edges off properly, and it can't make that seal contact. And it's happened to me before. It's so frustrating. And with only 2 jars, I really want this to work. So I screw the bands on fingertip tight, and then we're going to just go ahead and put those right into the pressure canner. This pressure canner can hold 5 regular quart-sized jars no, 6 regular quart-sized jars or 5 wide mouth quart-sized jars, which I still think is pretty good for our household. But I know some people make like 20 or 30 of these things at a time, and I just don't do that. So the 90 minutes have gone by and our jars are done. So we're just going to take them out of the canner. Be careful. Pressure canning makes everything extremely hot. So you do not want to burn yourself right here. This canner takes a long time to cool down. I think it takes almost the same amount of time as it does to process the jars as it does to, cool down. So it's, an hour and a half of cool down. These things have been in here for like 3 hours now. And it is still extremely hot. I mean, extremely hot. And you can see from the jars here that they're still boiling at the top. I mean, aggressively boiling, and they will continue to do that for another couple hours, if not a little bit longer. So do not touch them. Just like with the salsa, we're going to leave these on the counter and let them cool overnight. And then we'll check the seals in the morning and put them in our pantry. Now, let's go back to those skins in the food mill. This was something I wasn't sure if this was going to work. It was kind of like, let me just try this out. But I wanted to take all those skins and that pulp and stuff that didn't make it through, including seeds, and put it in my dehydrator to see if I could get this to dehydrate into a tomato powder. And you might be like, what am I going to use a tomato powder for? Definitely could use it as a seasoning, but what I want to use it for is as a tomato paste replacement. I made tomato paste last year with some extra tomatoes from my harvest because I had a bunch then, and I thought, hey, that would be cool to make my own tomato paste. And it was, but I got to tell you, that process is excruciating. It is so long and so, it just requires so much from you because, you have to sit there and baby it, because by the time it gets to a point where it's thick enough to be paste, it will burn on the bottom of the pot, even at a low temperature. So you really got to watch it, and you have to cook it like that for hours. So I'm basically just sitting in the kitchen watching this tomato paste, and it went on for like 2 days. It was something I decided I was never going to do again. But I really like making my own tomato paste at home. So I thought, I saw somebody do this online where they took tomatoes and they freeze dried them, and then they blended it into a powder, and then they made tomato paste by using the powder mixed with water, rehydrating it, and it creates a paste because you don't add very much water. You add mostly tomato powder and then just a little bit of water, and it makes the paste instead of, you having to go through this long process of canning it. And it's, shelf staple as well. So I thought I'd give this a try. I had some butterfly pea flowers already going in the dehydrator. So I added my tomatoes and I let it dehydrate, I think, for 24 hours at 140. And it came out perfect. I was so excited that this worked. It was crispy, they were crunchy, they were completely dry. So I put them in my magic bullet, which I have found to be one of the best things to blend spices from the dehydrator in. I probably could have used my regular blender, but it's so big and pulling it out was kind of a pain in the butt. Also, it was still a tiny bit wet from, washing it the day before. And so I didn't want any part of this getting wet, and I knew that my little magic bullet here was completely dry. And so I just used this. You kind of got to shake it a little bit to really get it to blend it up. But it made the best powder, and this works phenomenal. I tried it, I used the powder, I mixed it with a little water, and it produces the best paste I have ever had. Now, if I would have thought about this in advance, I probably would have added a pinch of salt to the powder, because when you make the paste, it's just straight tomatoes. And your tomato paste, you want to have a little bit of salt and probably a little bit of sugar to bring out the taste of the tomatoes. So if I would have done this again, I would have definitely added a little salt and sugar. And then we just pour it into a jar and put it on the pantry shelf. Once you put it in the jar, I like to add a moisture absorber into the jar with it, 1 or 2. This is a small jar, so I just did 1. But with our humid climate down here, even in our houses, it gets a lot of moisture. So this helps with all of my powdered herbs and vegetables. And that's it, guys. That is what I did with my 30 pounds of tomatoes from my spring harvest, and I couldn't be more happy with the results. I cannot wait to grow more tomatoes so I can do more tomato recipes. I hope you enjoyed this video today. If you want to watch a couple more of my videos between now and my next upload, check out these videos next. Happy gardening and happy preserving, guys.